It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, and I am joined as always by one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, Kent Myers.
Mick, today we want to do the second show of a two-part series on money laundering. We did the first show last week, and we talked about money laundering in the context of being the crime after the crime. Some kind of criminal activity produces large sums of money, and then the criminal must do something with that in order to make use of it. Just having it is of very little benefit if they can't dispose of it. And we had two good guests on last week that we've asked to come back again this week. Jay Farber with the United States Attorney's Office, and David Landrum, a retired IRS special investigator and a private consultant now in money laundering. And they're going to join us today again and discuss some aspects of money laundering that we haven't talked about before. We'll kind of complete the picture, I think, today. And our viewers, that include a lot of business people and people in the banking industry, I think will enjoy hearing what these guys have to say.
Well, this morning, part two of a two-part series examining money laundering in Oklahoma. It's next on The Verdict. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett, Kent Myers. Kent's going to introduce our guests.
Once again, pleased to welcome back David Landrum and Jay Farber. David is across the table from me, and he's making his second appearance on The Verdict. As you may recall, if you watched last week's show, he is a retired special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal and Investigation Division, and 10 years of the time that he spent with the IRS, he did it in an undercover capacity, working in money laundering investigations. He's a certified anti-money laundering specialist and is a consultant now to businesses and governments through Ronan Resources, LLC, a business located here in Oklahoma City. David, thanks for coming back again.
Thank you very much. Proud to be here.
We're pleased to have you. And to my right is Jay Farber, an assistant United States attorney for the Western District of Oklahoma. Since 1989, Jay's been a trial attorney in the United States Attorney's Office, but had many years trial experience prior to that. He's the lead attorney in the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, and we are pleased that you'd come back and join us again, Jay.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Let me ask you, David, to go back to our discussion of money laundering. Explain the types of domestic money laundering that we have.
Okay, the domestic money laundering can be anything really from going to a car dealership and purchasing a car, say in a nominee or a false name, to actually setting up a corporation. It could also be having a legitimate business and depositing illegally earned income into that business to commingle it and to conceal the true nature and source of it.
Do most money launderers use financial institutions like banks or the like to facilitate their transactions?
The majority of them do use banking institutions in some form. It's almost a requirement today, whether it's a bank, a financial institution, or a wire transfer business.
Last week we looked at a clip from Blow, and there was some text in it that I think may have misstated a little bit on the cost of money laundering. I guess people with money that need to launder it may have to pay somebody to engage in that illegal activity for them. What's your experience on generally what the cost would be that a money launderer would be charged?
The money laundering transactions usually charge, depending on the size of the transactions, anywhere from 2 to 4% of the total amount. Back when it first started, sometimes it would go as high as 10%. I think the video clip you're talking about mentions 60%, which I don't know that they were talking about money laundering fees or maybe the total cost. I'm not sure, but that's a little high.
Yeah.
Internationally, it seems like there's a lot of laundering taking place through wire transfers and the like. How does that take place, and is that the most prominent source of money laundering available to criminals today?
That's probably the easiest source for them to use, because wire transfers can place any amount of money anywhere in the world instantaneously. There are other systems, the Hawala system, which is an informal money laundering system, actually not necessarily money laundering, but can be for legitimate funds transfers as well. But yes, you're right, primarily wire transfers. There is physical smuggling of the money in and out of the country as well.
Well, we know which countries have loose alternate laws in this regard, do we not? And what might they be, and why would the United States allow these countries or not to pose some sort of financial restrictions on these type of transfers?
Well, there is an organization based out of Paris, the Financial Action Task Force, that keeps track of the different countries and their money laundering laws. The organization publishes a list of countries that have bad money laundering laws, which they try to use to put pressure on them politically. One thing that it does bad, or that might not be what the intended value of that would be to let people know where they could go to launder money.
Well, what about Swiss bank accounts?
Swiss bank accounts are the old-time money laundering vehicles. There have been many changes in, I believe, both the Swiss law and international law that now, under certain circumstances, allows access into those accounts by law enforcement officials.
Jay, let me direct something to you. Who prosecutes money laundering? Well, let's start in this country.
Well, the U.S. Attorney's Office certainly is involved in prosecuting people engaged in that activity, and in fact there are several statutes under Title 18, most notably, that deal with money laundering.
Federal statutes?
Absolutely, yes.
And your office, I guess, would be involved in it if there's activity in this district?
Absolutely. Whether it be a white-collar type offense, the underlying crime, or, as in my case, I prosecute a lot of cases with respect to drug dealing. That's also specified unlawful activity that we commonly have to deal with money laundering.
What about state prosecutors, Wes Lane in Oklahoma County or his counterparts across the state? Do they get involved in prosecuting money laundering?
You know, when I was in the DA's office many years ago, there was not a money laundering statute. And to be quite honest with you, I don't know if there is a state money laundering. I believe there is. But we do a lot more, I think, in the money laundering aspect. And I think part of the reason is that we can rely on some expert agencies like the IRS who are very intimately familiar with the statute and the way to seek evidence to support the charges.
Well, is it unusual or usual for you to have undercover personnel in the course of an investigation?
Well, a large part of my practice deals with a lot of people engaged in undercover work, primarily in the drug aspect, but concomitantly with that, they're engaged in undercover work in the money laundering aspect because drug dealers, they have to have a way of concealing their assets or buying assets to facilitate their ongoing drug ventures. So it kind of goes hand in hand.
Jay, I can almost hear a couple of bankers saying that the good news is we got $1 million deposit. The bad news is it's all in 20s. Are there banking institutions that you suspect have looked the other way over the years and allowed this type of activity to come into their banks?
It's been my experience that the banks that I have dealt with and that Dave and I have been involved in past cases are very, very vigilant with respect to reporting suspicious activity, filling out their forms appropriately to notify the federal government, IRS in particular, of these suspicious activities. So I would say that it's been my experience that no, they're in the business for dealing with legitimate folks.
So they corroborate and testify as necessary?
Oh, yes. To the extent that, say, a bank teller is familiar with somebody who has come in over and over again trying to do these particular suspicious transactions, we'll subpoena records to support that activity, and if need be, have a teller or somebody in that respect.
Well, when you go to court, how much do you have to prove? In other words, I mean, if it's legitimate that you know, the person brings in a lot of $100 bills every day, how much do you have to prove in the end to be able to get a conviction?
Well, some statute, there is no minimum amount. There's another statute where there's a $10,000 requirement before it triggers a potential money laundering charge. So there really is no minimum. We look at establishing the elements, whether somebody is trying to conceal or money from a specified unlawful activity like drug dealing or bank fraud or some other sorts of criminal activity. That's what we look for to meet the elements.
Let me get us to a short break. We're visiting with David Landrum and Jay Farber. We're discussing money laundering. You're watching The Verdict. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers back on The Verdict. This week's guests are David Landrum and Jay Farber. We're wrapping up a two-part series of shows discussing money laundering. Kent, what next?
David, it occurred to me that I don't really know how you would go about gathering evidence that money laundering is occurring. What kinds of people would you use? What kinds of documents? How would you just go about doing it?
Well, there are several different ways. If you have an undercover operation going, you have the undercover agent or the confidential informant that would be tape recording conversations with the subjects. That is very important because out of their own mouth you know whether or not they knew what they were doing. And those recordings are of utmost importance in that case. There are other methods that we call indirect methods to prove someone had money they did not have legally, and that being either direct testimony. For example, witness A testifies, I gave so-and-so $100,000 in cash to buy drugs on January the 1st. That is probably one of the better sources as far as witnesses are concerned, but very few of them keep records and know when or how much they paid at certain times. Another way to attack this particular issue would be to prove an entire financial investigation of an individual. In other words, all the money they spent versus all the legal money that they received.
Kind of the net worth method?
Exactly, the net worth method or a bank deposits method, something that would show that they generated money from an unknown source. Then you would have to have evidence that they were involved in an illegal business during the same time that they had that type of money.
Well, I have to ask you, when you were an undercover agent, without regard to any cases or anything, did you ever wear a wire or wear a recording device?
I did on almost all occasions.
And you never had any problem being discovered, I guess?
No, I was never discovered.
Did it concern you?
It always concerned me, and the thing that I worried most about was not that well, it was that they discovered me, but as an undercover agent, if they felt you were a law enforcement officer, they probably would not treat you the same way they would if they thought you were an informant.
Explain that.
If they thought it was an informant, whether he's wired or not, they might be much more harmful because they felt like he's one of them they could deal with, as opposed to a law enforcement officer, which they're just going to be hands-off probably, depending on the level of violence the particular group you're looking at has been involved in.
Was your work strictly in drug money laundering, or was it other types of criminal activity?
For the most part, but it had been, I had done some work in different types of criminal activity. Anything that generates money, the IRS was interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jay, when you're trying to get one crook to testify against another crook. How does all that work? And I imagine that's pretty sticky business.
We see it done every night on Law and Order.
Well, in some respects, there's some truth to that. In my business, we have to rely a lot, as Dave has already alluded to informants, and often we need to put them on the witness stand. And of course, they bring with them a lot of baggage, so to speak. And in order to establish their reliability, and more importantly, from my perspective, to demonstrate their credibility to a jury, we try to corroborate or substantiate many of the things they say. So money laundering investigation can help in that regard. For example, say an informant testifies that he was working for this particular drug dealer that was on trial, and he went to a bank to exchange a bunch of funds, or he bought a car for the drug dealer to use to make drug deliveries. With that information, we would go subpoena those particular agencies or interview people to corroborate or substantiate that story and bring them to court to justify or substantiate what the informant has said. So it greatly assists.
How do you protect an informant? Let's just say a citizen suspects that they know of some money laundering that's going on, and they fear that they might be in trouble if they were to report it. And maybe they're not 100% sure either. What advice would you have?
Well, we certainly encourage people to come forward. And just because you provide information doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have to testify to it. There are several occasions, and we take great efforts to try to accommodate them in any way we can, and try to work around it and get the information that they're providing us through other means so that we don't have to put them out as the source of the information.
When you're trying a case, how detrimental to the prosecution's case is it for the defense to bring out to the jury that this particular witness has made a deal bettering himself, lowering his time that he must serve or whatever the case may be, and therefore has a motive not perhaps to tell the truth or to exaggerate? You must face that in most all your cases. Is that something that's troublesome?
Actually, it can be, and it is. I face it in every case that I deal with, but we usually are able to overcome it. Primarily, like I said earlier, we corroborate the information as best we can, and if you can corroborate through independent means, through sources that the witness could not have had anything to do with or to manipulate, then that problem really is solved. And there are other ways that we are able to relay to the jury that a witness is credible, and some informants corroborate each other when you have more than one. So yes, it is a problem we confront all the time.
David, sometimes routine traffic stop will be made along I-35 or I-40, and they'll uncover drugs or a large sum of money, and you think, well, gee, that could have just as easily have gone right through our city, through this crossroads that we have. Do you ever wonder how much gets through Oklahoma City in that I-35, I-40 corridor that is undetected?
Yes, there's really no way to put your finger on it, but traffic stops are made all over the country where they discover large amounts of cash like that. The Highway Patrol here is doing a real good job at tracing and finding large sums of money and drugs.
Well, because I-35 is a corridor with Mexico, would that make it more likely that that type of activity happens through Oklahoma?
That does make it much more likely that it does happen that way.
What countries have you gone to, David, to train people? Besides Nigeria, I think.
Okay, I've been in, like I said, I've been to Nigeria, trained police officers there. I've been in Thailand. I have also been to Bosnia and Hungary. The other African country I've been to is Botswana in southern Africa. And if one thing I could say, you could take police officers anywhere in the world and exchange them with police officers here in the United States, and they're all pretty much the same. They have the same thoughts and fears and wonders.
We appreciate you guys coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks.
We're going to take a
Thank
break.
you.
We've been discussing money laundering. We'll be right back. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers. We are back to wrap up another edition of The Verdict, and today's show involved money laundering.
Finished up our two-part series on money laundering with our guests, David Landrum and Jay Farber. This is a crime everybody knows about, everybody hears about, does not suspect it happens much in Oklahoma, but according to these two fellows, it does happen a good bit in Oklahoma. Principally related to the drug trafficking activity, but not exclusively. Other types of criminal activity can bring about the large sums of cash that need to be laundered. I was fascinated by hearing some of David's stories about undercover work. It's something you think about and wonder how one does it, and now we know a little bit more about it. I hope if our viewers want to hear more about that or other types of similar shows, they'll let us know, because we'd be glad to put the guests together and give them what they want.
Some people are fascinated by these types of topics, and I want to drive you to a website. David's website is fraudconsultants.org if you'd like more information, or I guess he provides consulting services to business who need more information on this topic. I want to thank our guests, David Landrum and Assistant U.S. Attorney J.M. Farber, for being our guest on this show of The Verdict. And for Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time on another edition of The Verdict.